Welcome to this third session of the Journal Writing Workshop. The agenda for this session is to look at introductions and conclusions. As with last time, the process is to write the introductions and conclusions and then to place them in the established scaffolding, that is, into the outline as we've developed it, which now includes tables and figures. Here's a rough schematic showing where things are, and still there's plenty of white or blank spaces to do with method and so on, but we are moving forward nevertheless to establish the paper by building on the scaffolding. Remember that when you write the introduction and conclusions, it's a paper that's going to be read by different types of reader. Here I mentioned three types: the skimmer, the sampler, and the reader. Now, if we write our paper well, it will be attractive to all three of these types of reader. The skimmer really needs to read very quickly. They've got 2 minutes that they're going to devote to your paper in the first instance. And very quickly, they need to get the impression about what the paper is discussing. The sampler may take between 2 and 10 minutes to read the paper. Therefore, they'll pick up more detail, probably spend some more time looking at tables, figures, perhaps read the introduction in full, perhaps read the second half of the conclusion. They will get a much stronger impression of the content of the paper. And then thirdly, there's a reader who probably spend minimum of 20 minutes on the paper, maybe much more, get a full impression of where the story of the paper lies, and be really interested in what you've got to say. Now, to that last reader, the person who actually reads the paper thoroughly, you have to present your true academic credentials. They will have to see everything that you are capable of and the professionalism which you will present with the material. At the other extreme, the skimmer. You've got to tell very quickly the story at the beginning in the first few lines, if the skimmer's going to get what you're saying. The first few lines are crucially important to the skimmer, and indeed perhaps the abstract is the most important part of the paper for that person. They're only there for 2 minutes, remember. But also remember that part of your objective is to convert skimmers into samplers and to convert samplers into full readers. And the skill with which you write your paper can have such a transforming effect. Let's go on then and talk about the introduction and what's in it. What I list is 5 things that you probably would want in most introductions. First of all, if possible, the introduction should go straight to the issue or the need, and it should try to do it in either the first or the second paragraph. Don't be like the writer of a crime novel. Don't be like Agatha Christie. That is, don't be like somebody who doesn't tell the result of the story until the very last line. You've got to tell the result of the story early on. Also, do be dramatic and controversial. You can add controversy in the early part of the paper to draw the reader and to get the reader really interested in what you're writing about. And I'll come to that at the end of this section on introductions. I'll give you some examples of introductions that are quite dramatic. Having said that, it's also necessary sometimes to write a paragraph or two on the context first, and after that identify the need or the gap in the literature and then the controversial issue. Okay, Point number 2. What is the second thing to put into an introduction? You need to consider and supply the necessary background literature, probably in several paragraphs. References should include your previous work in the area if you've got any. They must also include the major work that launched your thinking on this paper. So if somebody's written a seminal paper before you that gave you the idea for this paper, then that's a paper that must get some mention in the introduction. Almost certainly there'll be some core pieces of research, could be 2 or 3, that drew you into this area, and those ought to be mentioned at this point. The third thing to include in the introduction is a discussion of the literature that leads you back to the gap or the need. Then fourthly, you can finish the introduction with a brief description of the contribution of your paper, possibly including some research questions. Those really are the 4 essential points. Sometimes as a 5th item, it's optional, but it's a thing that's becoming much more a requirement these days. It's a brief summary of the findings. And I've said there if it's appropriate for this particular journal. So you can check the journal to see whether that's the kind of thing that's written in the introductory sections of papers in the journal. And if it is, then you also can provide a brief review of your findings. Okay, here's a summary slide that shows the steps of the introduction in 6 dot points. Let me in the following 3 slides expand the view. Here's the first 2. First, there's 1 to 2 paragraphs of context, but only if needed. Early on in the paper, you must identify the issue, the need, or the gap. You can do that if you can. It's good to do that in paragraph 1. Now, here's the next 2 steps. Position your discussion in the broader literature and then continue with the literature to bring that discussion of broader literature back to the need or the gap. Then towards the end of the introduction, you will then be providing a justification for your research, and that leads you to a listing of your research questions or objectives. Then, if appropriate for the journal, give a taste of the findings. Okay, now here is here's some examples. Let's start with some examples. I've got 3 examples of introductions that from the first words of the paper create some interest. These first words also are informative. They tell the reader what the paper's about. So it's not that they are just controversial, it is that they are controversial in an informative manner. They also have the effect then of drawing the reader into the paper. In other words, these beginning words entice the reader to want to find out more and induce the reader to need to read further, to influence the reader's desire to actually explore what it is you are saying. So let's look at the first one. For many pundits and politicians, the internet represents the ultimate consumer panacea. In red, word of emphasis. Here's one of those words that emphasize things. So, for many pundits and politicians, the internet represents the ultimate consumer panacea. Indeed, The hubris surrounding the alleged benefits that the internet offers consumers is unprecedented. Foremost among What is this about? Well, it's about the benefits that consumers can derive from online purchasing. Or that's what the whole paper is going to be about. I think to me it creates drama without too much exaggeration in the words. It's exaggeration that amounts to an acceptable academic exaggeration. The words that are used are still academic words. The words that are used are still academic words, but they are somewhat exaggerated. Panacea, hubris, and unprecedented. Next one. Let's just read it through. How precisely do people know their preferences? It is common in applications of utility theory to assume that people know their preferences perfectly. In modeling people's choices, we therefore assume that error in estimation is attributable to missing variables or errors in measurement. But is this a reasonable assumption, especially when the preferences are about unfamiliar goods? So these are, again, the very first words of a journal article. And you can tell from that people are actually, in the real world, unaware of their preferences. And the writer of the paper argues that is, most people are unaware of their preferences. And it's about the consequences for utility theory when people are actually unaware of their preferences, but the theory assumes that they are aware. That's the tenor of the paper. It's clear that it is from what's written in this very first paragraph. And what's written there, for people who are interested in this area, is a highly interesting short paragraph. Next one. Again, creating interest from the start. Let's look at it. It is perplexing that, oh, look at those words, they draw the reader in. It is perplexing that, despite substantial effort to inform the public, the issue of global warming has not maintained its position as a high priority among Australian or US communities. Although Resser et al. Reported that 66% of Australian respondents were very concerned or fairly concerned about climate change, the Lowy Institute, Hansen, concluded that support for taking tough policy action continues to erode from a high level of 2006. Leveson et al. Reported that belief in climate change and its anthropogenic drivers has waned in recent years, matching trends in other Western countries. To most researchers in that area, that is a really interesting drawcard to want to read the rest of the paper. What's the paper about? It's about why public interest in global warming has reduced over time. Okay, let's move on. Let's now look at conclusions. Conclusions should begin with a brief précis of the context and purpose of the paper. For example, we embarked on a study of A, B, and C in order to show X, Y, and Z. That's a classic way to begin your conclusions. Second, structure the conclusions according to the structure of your paper, especially the structure that's in the introduction. That's why we write the introduction and the conclusions together. If you write them together, you can't talk about material in the conclusions that isn't foreshadowed in the introduction. So the structure of the conclusions should match the structure of the introduction, really. We can then discuss the results of each research question one at a time, or as an alternative, we can structure the conclusions according to the key contributions or the objectives. As we write these, we should write as knowledgeable researchers in the area. That is, we should write with aplomb. And to do that, you need to show that you've answered the questions that you said you would answer. So if in the introduction you've got a set of research questions, you must, in the conclusion, answer those research questions. That creates aplomb. It creates the impression, at least, that you know what you're talking about. You haven't wandered off to some other thing that was never intended to be in the article as far as this description in the introduction was concerned. You're not going to deal with things that you never mentioned at the outset. Next, the conclusion should be about serving the literature. It's very important to understand that the conclusion is a statement which is giving instructions to your colleagues in the research community. The conclusion should be about serving the literature. You are positioning your paper within the literature, and you should be saying how you've done this positioning. So the conclusion should briefly explain what the literature was saying before the research and what the contribution of the research is that changes the literature in some way. Do your findings add to, confirm, or disconfirm the existing literature? Then you need to do this. You need to unpack the contributions of your findings and say what they mean. And meaning is an important contribution of the conclusions. You need to say what these findings mean for managerial practice, for industry and government policy, and importantly, what they mean for future research. So there are practitioners in the world, that is in my context, it's farmers or agribusiness decision makers, whose practice could be changed. There could be government policy that is influenced by what you do in your research paper. And certainly there'll be future research and peers of ours who could be influenced by what we've done in our paper. And we've got to describe in the conclusions what are our contributions to these three different types of people. Describing the meaning of the results is important. Okay, here's a 5-step summary of the conclusions. The next 3 slides will show an expanded view of that. So, begin the conclusions with a brief précis of the context and the purpose of the paper. That leads on to the remaining part of the conclusions, which is structured according to the key contributions or the key research questions or the key objectives. That would then lead on to the next step, so that for each objective or research question or contribution, explain what the literature was saying before the research and how the findings have changed that research. For each objective, explain the implications for management practice, for industry and government policy, and for future research. And that would lead on to a review of your conclusions. Then as you review the overall conclusions, remember, as with Italian pizza, you don't need to have every ingredient for it to taste good. In other words, you may have written conclusions which are far too long and contain some minor results which are not important to the main story. you can simply cross them out. Conclusions are for the major results and their implications, and for discussing the meaning of those results for users of your work. So we now go on to a work session. We now go on to a work session on introductions and conclusions. Once you've written the introduction and conclusion, you should place these within the outlines as shown in the next 2 slides. So this shows where we currently are before we've written the introduction and conclusions. And the next slide shows us where we are once we've included the introduction and the conclusions. And that is the end of this session.